there are also articles about this on basically any psychological concept, like emotions, well-being, or friendship attention. You can find an article where people argue that the concept is not well defined, it's ambiguous, and we should either start using it or refine it or break it into smaller pieces and so on. So this kind of complicates the task of finding a good psychological theory. So theory construction in psychology at the moment, I think, is done in this problem space that is not only vast and very unconstrained, but it's also poorly structured and ill-defined. So another way of, or sort of counterpart of this, or another way from a different framework, is that the psychological theories, when they are so unconstrained, are strongly underdetermined. There's just not enough constraints or robust phenomena to determine which theory is better. So just to give an example of this, and when you have this kind of underdetermination and then you find some theory that seems to explain something, it might seem like a plausible theory, but because there's actually so little constraints, the theory might be completely off. And that actually, I think, happens quite a bit. Here is one classic example, namely intelligence. One of the success stories of psychology. And one of the most robust phenomena in psychology is this so-called positive manifold, namely that the results of different types of intelligence tests are positively correlated. Also, both within person, across persons, and all kinds of tests, you always find positive correlations of different types of intelligence tests. And this was actually the birth of factor analysis 100 years ago, when Spearman argued that all of these correlations are best explained by one underlying factor, the so-called G factor. So here you have different types of intelligence tests that are positively correlated, and then the best explanation, according to Spearman and others, is that there's one G factor that is the cause of these different results. And it fits the data very well. Seems like a nice explanation. But recently, researchers in Amsterdam have put forward a completely different model of intelligence that explains the data at least equally well. It's the so-called mutualism model, or complex dynamic systems model of intelligence. We don't have to go into the details here, but the idea is that you have all of these different subsystems in the brain, like maybe ability to concentrate, or learning ability, and so on, which are causally interacting with each other. And it's these interactions of these subsystems that actually creates the positive correlations, and not some kind of one underlying G factor. So in this picture, the G becomes just an statistical artifact construct that we get from those positive correlations, but the real causes of the results of intelligence tests are something completely different and something very complex. And I don't think that this is the final word on it, or I'm not claiming that this is even the right model. The point here is that because we have this strong underdetermination by phenomena and this huge problem space, it is easy to come up with explanations. But even if we hit something that seems nice, it doesn't mean that it's the right model. So, okay, so the problem space is very big. What can we do about it? Obviously, it would be nice to somehow narrow down the problem space or make it smaller. But how to do that? Of course, there's no magic silver bullet solution, but I think there are some things that we can at least discuss or think about. And this is all going to be very speculative, even more speculative than the rest of the talk. So very happy to hear your thoughts or feedback on these ideas. And also, most of these are not new. They are building on the work of Bob and Bill and Carl and others. So let's see. Well, one perhaps obvious thing is to make the problem space smaller by making the problem smaller and focusing on local models instead of global theories. And this is, I think, one of the great ideas of this mechanistic explanation paradigm, that we, instead of coming up with a grand theory of how the mind works, we just focus on very local case-specific instances and try to explain those first, case by case. And I think memory research is a great example of this. I had this on the slides before I saw your talk, so it's just a coincidence. But I think also the stuff that Carl talked about was exactly illustrating this very well, how you can gather all of these robust phenomena, sometimes even about one single person, and then see those phenomena set a lot of constraints on what kind of explanations we can have for the deficit in that specific case. And if we focus on such a small context, perhaps even just one person, it's much more plausible to come up with the good explanations than focusing on bigger explanations or theories. And also, I think in memory research, there's much more attention to conceptual issues than elsewhere in psychology. Like, people really think hard about what are the different forms of memory and which of them are plausible. and try to refine those concepts in this kind of iterative way. I think at least more than in many other fields of psychology, like clinical psychology. But the worries that I have is that maybe these are more like outliers, and that when in most cases it's more that everything is actually connected to everything in psychology, and it's really hard to come up with any local models. There's, for example, this book by Pessoa published this year called The Entangled Brain, where he argues that the brain is just, like I said a few slides ago, that every neuron is connected to thousands of other neurons across areas. So maybe there is no modularity. According to him, there is no modularity in the brain, and there's also nothing even close to near decomposability. And then it becomes really hard to make local models and explanations because everything is sort of in one way or another connected to something else. And also, if you think about mental disorders like depression, they are extremely complex, multi-level, multifaceted things. Like depression include cognitive aspects, psychological symptoms, affective aspects, but also physiological symptoms like insomnia or phenomenology, how you experience depression, and of course the chemical stuff related to the neurons and so on. So it's really hard to just come up with any kind of a small local model of depression. So here is one attempt, or there is this network idea of mental disorders, where mental disorders are seen as networks of causally interacting symptoms. Here is one possible network of depression symptoms and how they causally interact. But of course, then one might wonder why exactly these symptoms, and why only psychological symptoms. And also people who are advocating these models, they are very ready to admit that this is just a very, very incomplete picture, and we need, actually there are many other causes that are outside of this picture. So my worry is that if you try to make local models, whereas the world is actually more complex than that, then you will end up with spurious relationships and results that are actually not there. There's also whole causal inference literature on that, but I don't have time to get that into it now. Okay, another way of constraining the space of possible models of explanations is to find more robust phenomena. And I think the focus in psychology is often too much on these exciting, unexpected findings, where I think in this sort of problem-solving, problem-space picture, any kind of boring phenomena are also important constraints, not just the exciting, splashing ones. And Darwin also, if you look at the origin of species and how he came up with his theories, it also included phenomena that are not that exciting, at least not in the context of, outside of that context, namely like cattle breeding, or he was looking at plants in a hayfield next to his house, he was looking at worms in his own garden, wrote even a whole book about them later, and barnacles and stuff like that, which are not the most exciting things, but they still were extremely important constraints for his theory. And I think this is something also where these fancy new developments in deep learning and AI can be useful. I don't think AI is very good at coming up with theories, but it's good at finding patterns in data that humans sometimes may not be able to detect. So perhaps that can also contribute in finding more robust phenomena. And there's a project now, there's this big paper project where I'm just one of the many authors, but it's with Denny Borsbaum, who is a psychologist, and Jim Woodward, and we're writing a paper on the importance of phenomena detection in psychology and how it has been neglected in favor of other stuff in psychology. But that will take a while before it comes out. So another possible way forward is, of course, something that also plays an important part in the discovering complexity, and that's heuristics. So we cannot go through the whole space, so we have to find, I think, basically anything that works. And just as a side note, also, I think related to Karl's talk, I think that the heuristics of decomposition and localization probably will not work in the context of psychology and stuff like clinical psychology and mental disorders. This is also something that I was very happy and interested to see in the book already in '93. Bill and Bob argued that, or point out at somewhere in passing, that decomposition and localization probably won't work in psychology because there's just too much interactions. It's more interaction-centered than component-centered, and that's why we cannot, those heuristics might fail. So we need some other heuristics, I don't know what, and but the more general point is that we shouldn't look for the true model in the problem space, but we should just look for anything that gives us the so-called best bang for the buck in terms of predictability or regularities. So just look at, for example, explanations at different scales or different levels, and have this sort of pragmatic attitude that we don't have to look for the true or final model, but anything that works. Okay, another point that I want to make is about reconceptualizing the phenomena, or I think very close to what in the book was called reconstituting the phenomena. And this is, I think, where the difference between conceptual constraints and phenomena constraints becomes important, because phenomena constraints are something that we cannot just choose to get rid of. Robust phenomena are there, and usually, if they're really robust, they are not even tied to a specific conceptual framework. Whereas conceptual constraints are something that we can change, and sometimes it can be useful and helpful to change them. So, and I think this is also nicely connected to Margaret Bowden's work on creativity, who also comes from this same Simon-style tradition of problem space and problem solving, but then applies it to the issue of creativity. She has written many books on this, and she distinguishes different types of creativity. Here I focus on just two types, namely exploratory creativity and transformational creativity. So the idea of exploratory creativity is that you have a certain conceptual space, and then you search through the space for some exciting or new stuff within the boundaries of that space and within the rules of that conceptual space. So, for example, following certain art style or style of painting or cuisine. But then you have the more fundamental transformational creativity, which is about changing the problem space and changing the constraints and rules themselves, which then allows for new ideas that were not possible in the old framework at all. And classic examples are stuff like Einstein, who, of course, got rid of the whole existing problem space and started from a different conceptual foundations. So that can also help to make progress by transforming the problem space into something else that then might be more manageable and smaller. So, but how would this work in psychology? This is all completely unclear to me, but I'm very happy to hear about your thoughts. But currently, most concepts in scientific psychology are still some, in one way or the other, based on folk psychology, like attention, emotions, friendship, and so on. They are not exactly our standard common sense concepts, but they are somehow derived from them. And it has been noted by many, most famously Fodor, that they work remarkably well. I can explain why we are here in this room. The only explanation any one of us can give is based on folk psychology and our beliefs and desires and so on. But it also has been noted by many that they don't work that well and often fail completely and miserably. So they are not super. So I think if we think about this in the problem space framework, I think one way of seeing is that these folk psychology-based scientific concepts are kind of a local maximum of predictability, where we have this local small hill of predictability where we are now. I mean, maybe these concepts of folk psychology are the result of thousands of years of evolution and cultural evolution, and we just figure out something that works. And it works to a certain extent, and then it's really difficult to find anything that works better. And if we start changing those concepts, we end up in this deep valley where nothing works anymore. But perhaps somewhere in the distance there is this global maxima or higher hills of predictability, where we can actually explain stuff and predict stuff better based on some different concepts. But it's just really hard to get there because there are all these valleys in between. But this is just a speculation. Anyways, I think the most important point here is that we need, in psychology, there should be much more attention to conceptual clarification and this epistemic iteration of improving concepts. I have a paper on that with Laura Brinkman and Timon Elmer. And there is also all this work in cognitive ontologies that I think is very important and relevant and should also receive more attention. Like Russell Podrock worked on this. Carl has a paper on this with Jolene Franken and Mark Slors. Jackie Sullivan has written on this, and of course, John Bickel has a more radical revisionary ontology where we just get rid of psychology completely. But on the other hand, there are also many people in theoretical psychology who argue for the opposite, and namely that psychology should actually be only concerned with this ordinary language, common sense concepts, and empirical psychology is a mistake, that we can only understand psychology. So it's coming from this Wittgensteinian tradition that we just have to understand our ordinary language terms, and that's really what psychology should be about. So there's no disagreement at all, even about the general direction where we should go if we want to reconceptualize psychology. There's complete disagreement. And also the practical problem here is what I mentioned earlier, the generative entrenchment, namely that psychological concepts like depression, they are very much ingrained into our society. If you want to get treatment, you have to have a diagnosis. If you want to get funding from an insurance company, you have to have a diagnosis, and that's all based on these psychological concepts like major depressive disorder and so on. So they are so deeply entrenched into all these practical societal things that it's really just hard. It's easy for a philosopher like me to say that we should change it and come up with better concepts, but in practice there are these very practical constraints that we also cannot just ignore. Okay, so those were some ideas about how to impose more constraints or to narrow down the conceptual space in psychology. But now I will then turn back to the starting point and this idea of the theory crisis in psychology and the theory construction methodology and what all of these points mean for that debate. Okay, so as I pointed out in the beginning, there is this rather surprising consensus and agreement, or near consensus, that the solution is formal theories or computational modeling, and that will help to improve the bad state of psychological theorizing. Now, I think in the light of what I said before, I think this is not going to be the solution unless we also have enough constraints, which we certainly do not have at the moment. So just saying that people should make formal theories is not going to help, I think, at all. In fact, it can make things worse, because using complex formalisms and mathematics can just give the impression that you're doing something scientific and important, even though the conceptual problems haven't gone anywhere. You don't solve any of these issues that I talked earlier by just applying mathematics and formalisms, at least as far as I can see. So like this theory construction methodology, identifying relevant phenomena, formulating a theory, then making it formal, and testing it. You can do this, and you can keep on doing this for the rest of your life, for thousands of years, and you still won't hit on a good model unless you have enough constraints, I think. So while this is important, it's not going to help, I think, with the theory crisis. Also, yeah, I started with this example of psychological theory, and the criticism often was that it is somehow verbal or unspecified. But there's also a mathematical version of this model. You can make it mathematical. You can put numbers on these balloons, and you can put equations for those arrows, and that's what people have done also. And here is the formal model of a theory of blind behavior. But is it now a better theory? Is it now a good theory? It's a rhetorical question. So just to conclude with some thoughts and questions to you also. So one point I hope to have made is that unconstrained theory construction is usually not going to be productive. In most areas of psychology, there are simply not enough constraints because we have this immense problem space, immensely complex system, and we don't have enough robust phenomena to constrain it. And I also mentioned in passing that this premature formalization can, in fact, help to mask the underlying conceptual challenges and the lack of constraints. And the questions I have is, am I being too pessimistic here about psychology? And also, am I missing some key literature? Because I have a feeling that there's more literature on these constraints and problem-solving framework than I actually know of. So that's what I would like to hear more about. But before we go to Q&A, I would again like to thank Bob. I went through my archives and I found one picture of me and Bob. It's not the greatest picture, but it's the only one I found. So here I'm giving a talk. We're actually giving a talk together on levels of organization in Delmenhorst a very long time ago. I think 2011 or something like that. So again, I would like to thank Bob for all the great discussions and ideas I got from you, that also led to this talk and for me standing here now. So thanks.
Okay, we are slotted to go until 1 o'clock, which leaves us almost a half an hour for discussion. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I really like the idea that having better constraints gives you a more manageable field of things to explain, and so it makes theories more open to construct in a sense. But I guess one of my concerns about how to move forward with that is, how do we identify good constraints versus like arbitrary constraints, right? Because it seems like Just as you might have an arbitrariness in dealing with a very wide open field, you might also have an arbitrariness in how you narrow that field down into some phenomenon or other, right? And so how is it you negotiate those constraints? Is there some way to like check, like an error? Here's how I know my constraint has gone wrong to some degree or another. Or is that just another thing that adds to this problem? Is that it's not just that the field's open, it's that the solution of implementing constraints to narrow down the field is also itself hard in some sort of unmanageable way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's indeed hard, but I think the nice thing about robust phenomena as constraints is that you cannot just easily decide to get rid of them. And if they are really robust in the sense developed by Wimsatt and others, that they can be sort of verified by many independent means, then they are just there and they are what they are. And we know that they are good constraints in the sense that it's not just a matter of, we cannot just choose to ignore them if they're truly robust, so they are there. But I think your point is very relevant for the conceptual constraints. There it's really hard to see indeed when are these conceptual constraints good or when are they bad, when should we change things and not. Yeah, I think there's no easy answer for that except that having some kind of standard like predictive power, explanatory power, that then helps us guide us towards better frameworks.
I think I saw Bob. Yeah.
Now I have no idea what the right answer to your questions are. I don't know what the right answer to your questions are, but robustness is certainly one possibility. Logan and Woodward emphasize that you don't have phenomena unless you have that's robust, which seems right. That also ties up with someone who Bill and I, neither one of us would underestimate Bill Wimsatt's influence on us and the value of his thought about his thinking about robustness and the centrality of it. So robustness is one constraint. Neil, just to inject a little bit of doubt, Paul Neil is a great case of a psychologist who can just dismantle theories. And what he often does, at least in some of his work, is to emphasize that what might look like a robust constraint really is generated by some artificial technique you impose. The paper on the slow progress of soft psychology is a great example of this. If people haven't read it, they should. And you mentioned it, I think.
Yeah, indeed, great.
Well, I don't have any good answer. I'm interested in what more you have to say.
No, those are great points, and great that you mentioned Wimsatt, because of course I think he's also has been tremendously influential for all of this, also in my work. And the robustness, indeed, that's one way forward, especially in identifying robust phenomena. But then if we talk about robust theories or robust concepts, then it gets more difficult to say when is a concept robust and when is a theory robust. So it gets harder. And the point about Paul Meehl is great. I'm also a great fan of Paul Meehl. And but yeah, the criticism of Paul Meehl is often indeed he just destroyed everything, but didn't put everything instead to replace that. And I think that's a general problem in psychology. It's very easy to show how things are wrong, but very hard to show what is good and how things could go right.
I think we had a question from Carl. Was that a two-parter? Is that why you gave me the two?
Oh, no, it was just sort of
it was
my cool way of.
Okay, Carl, cool question.
Yeah, I found myself wondering as you were going on, why is this so different than biology? And then I started trying to answer my question and I was thinking, oh, well, they got evolution and they got genes. And then I thought, well, so do we. So do we. And and do you think biologists don't seem to be all in a giant uproar about the lack, physiologists. Like, where is our general theory of physiology? Like, well, you need one for the circulatory system, you need one for the osmoregulatory system, you need one for what? They don't seem puzzled by this, and they don't seem to have difficulty pursuing it in the way that psychologists seem to be tearing their hair out at the roots. So what? Do you share my assessment that this is a panic in neuroscience and psychology and not one in physiological biology? And then the question is, why? Because they both seem to have the same resources.
Yeah, but I think It's a very good point, but I think one important problem is the conceptual unclarity that you have a lot in psychology and much less in physiology. You have much more well-defined things you're studying, and things that you're doing, and they're also much more easily manipulable, and you have much more robust phenomena. You can more easily make things more local because everything is not so massively interconnected. So I think those are some differences that make it less dramatic in physiology than in cognitive neuroscience or psychology.
So it's just the holistic nature of psychology.
Well, that's one part of it, and the conceptual unclarity, and the massive complexity also that we cannot just easily bracket or get rid of.
Follow-up.
Yeah, one place they do have, where biologists do have this problem is the evolution theory, where there are worries about what constraints you can place and can't place, whether traits are relatively independent or not, whether that means they have to be developmentally independent. How the heck do you make any sense of that idea? This stuff has happened, especially in evolutionary biology, maybe not physiology as much, but leads to some really interesting work as a result.
Yeah, so I think it's a matter of degree. It's not like in one field you have these problems and in the other field you don't. It's just you have them to some extent in certain fields and to more extent in other fields. And I think psychology is at the end of the spectrum where you have the disastrous amount of these problems. But it doesn't mean that other fields don't have these problems, I would say.
It's important that in physiology we link onto things that are clearly necessary for the survival of the organism, whereas friendship is not clearly necessary for the survival of the organism. And so, and the constraints under which the absence of friendship would be problematic for you, when, how long.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob, I interrupted you.
Is that a hand, Stuart?
Yeah.
Stuart.
Thanks for the nice talk. Carlo, I think the answer is that it enters into the space of reason. That's why.
That might be right.
Yeah, but a more general question for you is, you talk about, I'm interested in the relationship between what you're calling phenomenal constraints and conceptual constraints. Because, it sounded like you were saying, well, there can be these robust phenomena that are sort of independent of conceptual constraints, but I bet we don't mean that. So could you talk about how, if we're thinking about how to play those constraints off each other to lead to sort of revisions, to reconstruction of the phenomena and so on, can you say something about methodologies there?
Methodologies, not sure, but I think I can say something about robust phenomena, and I think that to some extent they are independent of conceptual constraints. I think it's also in the work of Woodward and Bogan and Hacking. Others talk about the phenomena, how that lives a life of its own, stabilizing phenomena, and so on. That they're not completely independent of theorizing, but often they are much more stable. Theories can change, explanations can change, but still the patterns in the movement of the stars, they are the same that they were always. So in that sense, I think there is a degree of independence from between robust phenomena and the concepts and theories that we have. In that sense, you can change theories without changing the phenomena to some extent.
Right, but often a key, I mean, just to take a sort of very obvious example of this, Einstein changed what the phenomena were in a certain really important way. I mean, you can move it and you can say, oh, well, when you operationalize it, you'll see the same thing, but there's a certain sense in which a key part of solving some of these problems was looking at the same phenomenon and saying they're different phenomena. And I worry in psychology that we might have a sort of similar a similar problem that we wouldn't want to overestimate how clear the phenomenon would be.
Yeah, I see that point. So the phenomena are more closely intertwined with the concepts than might seem. Yeah, that's possible. That would be even more bad news, I think, for psychological theorizing. But I think Yeah, I think also in the Einstein case, this is a very difficult question, but I think there are arguments pro and con saying that there is, I mean, if there are basic phenomena about the dropping objects and how they fall that are very robust and they don't change, they didn't change when Einstein came up with his new theory, but it leads to very murky territory of defining what is a phenomena and how do they change and so on. So I think you're right. It's more complicated than I presented in this talk, and something to think about.
Yeah, great, thanks. Just to follow up on some of the discussions you, Bob, and Carl were having, because I think when you think about sciences like molecular biology, I see two differences between the way psychology and the way that, or evolutionary biology and the way that molecular biology works. And one of them is that you've got better tools, better research tools, and you've got a kind of institutionalized practice of building tools.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just for you've got these kind of driving problems to build new tools, and you spend a lot of your time building tools. And the second difference is these sciences are not theory driven. I mean, they're not on the search for theory. They've just got some rough and ready ideas about how proteins fold and how binding sites work, and then you just go and you just start doing your experiments, and theory emerges. Mm-hmm. It's not something you go out and you're not staring into it. Theory just emerges from the results that you get, and so you've got theory is kind of tertiary to theory development, kind of tertiary to just the kinds of tinkerings around in the labs and developing of new tools, and then theory just kind of comes about just without kind of like this grand search for theory.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point.
So make that the methodology psychology, and maybe you would improve.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that's indeed a huge difference, and I think that's why I also think that this kind of theory construction methodology is not the way to go, because you can't just decide now we're going to start building theories. You have to be indeed driven to the theories based on the robust phenomena, the empirical results, and the constraints that you have. But the thing is that it's just not happening in psychology.
No.
And that's how to make that happen. That's the big problem.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
You had a question in the middle.
Hi. Hopefully I can formulate this clearly enough. I'm thinking of this problem, like our concepts and terms in psychology. You can't like look at the brain and find a psychological concept. So we come up with them by thinking about behavior and these phenomena we observe in the world. And that's just really messy and hard to pin down. And it seems to me like we can't have our starting place being to like clarify these concepts. What we're doing is clarifying the concepts, and that's what creates this like ballooning of the problem space. And this is just like the first step, and then tapering it down or narrowing it down once we can start to really understand how our terms are mapping onto what we're discovering in the world. Like it just seems like a natural progression that it would get really out of hand before it gets really understandable.
Yeah, I think I agree, indeed. So you're basically saying that we have to do conceptualization in psychology, but it's going to be a complete mess, at least at first, and then maybe at some point we can get some clarity out of it.
And we can't do that to solve the problem. It's just going to have to resolve itself as we. Yeah,
but it's not very helpful as an advice to psychologist, I guess. But I see the point. I think it's a good point.
We had a question over here, red shirt.
Yeah, based on the discussion of like tools in biology and biology not being as theory driven, I'm wondering in psychology, we don't seem to have as good of a way of developing tools. So in place of that, are we going to have to use more artificial constraints to try and get more robust phenomena or observe the phenomena more robustly?
Yeah, I think so. I think indeed I'm myself very skeptical about the possibilities of coming up with any good psychological theories in the near future. So I think it's indeed better to focus on discovering robust phenomena for many reasons. And also one reason that I didn't mention is that those phenomena themselves can be sometimes very interesting and informative about how we function as human beings. Like there are these famous results about biases of thinking and biases of reasoning by Kahneman and others, the base race policies, and so those are robust phenomena that tell us something important about how humans work, but they're not theories, and we have no idea about the theories behind them. So I think the best way forward for psychology is to just forget about the aim of coming up with theories and just focus on phenomena. Also because we don't really have tools like we have in other sciences. I cannot even imagine what the tools would be in psychology. How can you have a tool or instrument to study people at the psychological level in the space of reason, so to speak? So, yeah.
Question here, yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's this stream of work in this theory crisis and psychological debate that urges for formal modeling as a sort of means of theoretical or conceptual clarification. You warn that premature formalization can be pernicious to this. Under what conditions do you think formalization of a theory can be benign or beneficial?
Very good question. I think I'll also reply that some of these authors give me often then what they mean by formalization is also clarifying and specifying things more precisely. And if that's what you mean by formalization, that we just define terms more clearly and have more better justification for what variables we use and what they exactly mean, then of course I think that's very important and can be helpful. So I think that if that's an important part of this formalizing theories, then I think that's very valuable. And I also think that in some contexts, some very local restricted context where we already know enough about the robust phenomena like perceptual processes, perhaps, then it might be very helpful to come up with formal mathematical models. But in most cases, like mental disorders, we just simply don't have, it's way too early for that, or maybe there will never be a time for that because the massive complexity.
Good question in the back.
So this might just be an expression of my misunderstanding, but I guess I'm wondering how robust the phenomena psychology can be, say, relative to biology. So we talked about folk psychological concepts, and you also have folk biological concepts. In the folk biology, the phenomena is independent of the concept. Whenever you think about your stomach doing what it does, the stomach will continue doing what it does. When you think about emotions, about like action, stuff like that, my full psychological concept affect how I behave, right? And it has to do with the idea of like reality in the space of reasons, and now as to like how we hold responsible, how we react to things. So it seems that there the phenomena changes, not completely reinvented or anything, but it does change according to those concepts, and so there will be that independence, so it will be as robust in a sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. Going back to the point of Stuart earlier, so indeed, there might be more connection between the concepts and phenomena than I argued for, but still, I think we can disentangle them to a certain extent. If you think about, again, this phenomenon of biases of thinking and reasoning, it's an extremely robust phenomenon that people are really bad at statistical reasoning and make all of these same mistakes with different populations in different contexts. It's very replicable and holds very well. And is it really bound to a certain theory or conceptualization? I'm not sure. I think it's quite independent of any theory or conceptualization. So I think at least some phenomena in psychology are robust and independent of theories, but in some other cases, maybe not. Like if you have, so especially in the case of mental disorders, I think what phenomena you see also depends on what kind of concept you have. So it really depends. Yeah.
In thinking about possible constraints, there's old idea from Patricia Churchland, right, that neurophilosophy might provide a constraint, and in particular, a kind of commitment to an interactive explanation involving multiple levels that has echoes of Grim's. If you're thinking about biology, right, physiologists do go off and do their own things and develop their own tools, but often they're concerned with something that's a robust phenomenon that emerges from all of that. So, for instance, cancer research, right?
Yeah.
Surgeries, medical intervention, understanding of the role of genes, right? And the way we've advanced as far as we have is by holding those as being constrained by some sort of commitment to physicalism, that all those levels are sort of explaining something that's deeply connected.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we do that enough in psychology. And what do you think of that physicalism as broadly as a kind of rough constraint that might help?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and also one one thing I didn't talk about in the talk was this idea of constraints of different levels, which is also a big part in the book, that you have bottom-up constraints and top-down constraints. And then if you have a level here in the middle, it's constrained by findings from above and findings from below. I think that's important type of sort of constraints, maybe falls into the category of robust phenomena in general. But in the, yeah, of course, then you have more general things like materialism, but I'm not sure if that's really sufficient. I think most people in the psychology debate, they already agree that it's kind of all based on the brain in some ways, and that we have to be materialistic. But still, within that constraint, you can come up with all kinds of wild theories about how psychology works. But this idea of constraints from multiple levels, I think that's an important part that I didn't mention explicitly in the talk.
Let me try one more. You mentioned the work on heuristics and constraints as robust. If you contrast what Tversky and Kahneman say with what Gigerenzer and company say, they're not so robust.
Yeah.
And one sort of, I don't know the right way to attack this, but one question you might want to ask is, which of these theories, either, really does offer robust and reliable answers?
Yeah.
And when?
Yeah.
And maybe it'll only be when you get down and dirty into the details of bigger answers, simple heuristics, or Tversky and Kahneman's failure to actually give specific versions of heuristics.
Yeah.
It may only be there that you'll find answers. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great addition. Gigerenzer's critique of Kahneman and Tversky, I should also really look into that as well.
He certainly thinks there's a failure.
Yeah. That's a very good suggestion.
Radical failure, triple fix.
More questions? All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So